Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Shaken Not Burned. Today we're going to be talking about the intersection of AI and sustainability and the profound implications it has for the tech industry. It can optimize energy networks. It can create more effective forecasting for renewable energy. It can help you with supply chain optimization. It can help you with environmental monitoring. And for a lot of us, it's really, really useful for managing the process of complying with regulatory demands. The problem is that with AI, there's a lot of philosophical conversation about the ethical questions, but there are two clear challenges in the use of AI. One of which is this belief that technical solutions are going to solve all our problems, some kind of silver bullet sometime in the future. But at the same time, we're pouring resources into AI, into a technology in an industry that is actually built on resource extraction. The more we rely on it, the more we potentially intensify the climate crisis. So today we're being joined by someone who spends a lot of time thinking about and has a lot of experience at working with AI and how it impacts on society. Dr. Tamara Rees is Project Director of Data and Society's Algorithmic Impact Methods Lab, which we're going to discuss later, otherwise known as AIMLab, where she's the senior researcher. Tamara, welcome to the show. I was hoping as an introduction, you could share a little bit about your journey, your work in academia, your work within technology and, within climate. What motivated you to think about the intersection of technology and environmental impact?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on the show. So I have a background in media studies and gender and sexuality studies. My PhD is from NYU's Department of Media, Culture, and Communication. It's a very interdisciplinary department, but tends to be much more focused on the humanities. And so I'm not trained as an engineer. I'm not a computer scientist, but I've always been very interested in understanding how organizations both track their own sustainability journeys and think about their relationship to producing tech for good in the world, and the different kinds of funding structures and power structures that shape how technology is built and deployed. And a lot of my research over the years is focused on the death of technologies and the systems that maintain technologies. And so my book is all about the problem of attempting to maintain the digital assets of individuals over generations, and what are the data infrastructures and maintenance practices that you need in order to preserve data in the long term, particularly if you're talking about something like a social media memorial, but then also in the way that a lot of our data is now attached to objects in the world, to smart homes, and to a lot of physical infrastructures and devices as well. That tension between the fact that technology is in many respects built to break down because companies would like us to buy more of their products. And so that does not fit very well with the model in which you're attempting to have technologies and particular digital assets be maintained in the long term?
It's a fascinating question because there's that idea of how you create longevity, how that doesn't work with what we need to work with in terms of circularity and keeping these critical minerals and, metals within the system if we're remaking them. But at the same time, we've got that sort of huge energy demand increase, Microsoft's net zero targets, and the fact that, it was doing quite a good job in moving towards them. And then last year, its emissions were up nearly 30% in a year just due to data centers. So I suppose from a business perspective, I'm wondering, what are the questions that you think we need to be asking about the use of AI? Where are the blind spots that we have that we need to be considering?
So I think it's important to place the current hype around AI and generative AI in particular in a historical context, even if we're talking about a 3-year period as a historical context. Because when I was working on a sustainability team, a green software product team at Intel, that was the era of crypto. And it was also the era of the metaverse. And so a lot of our conversations were about using blockchain for sustainability purposes, using blockchain to help with supply chain transparency. And the metaverse was imagined as this new concept that would be really lucrative for a business like Intel's, because we were going to essentially build the infrastructure for the metaverse. Now, clearly, after the crypto crash and many of the other issues around cryptocurrency were exposed in terms of scams, so people were sort of disenchanted. And generative AI emerged at a very convenient time for the tech industry. And I think that generative AI can be really impressive. There are things that it can do that are quite amazing, and it can be useful. I think there's so much excitement right now. There's been a lot of changes within the tech industry. So we have a very different financial landscape. The era of the 0% interest, is over. We are now in a period where tech workers do not have the power that they did during the pandemic years, during the expansion of tech, when tech companies were competing for talent. We now have a period of mass layoffs, and generative AI in many ways has caused organizations to change their priorities and to let go a lot of their previous commitments to things like sustainability or responsible AI, and things that are considered soft as opposed to a kind of business critical investment. And so there's been a tendency towards creating leaner teams, leaner organizations, and generative AI is imagined as the thing that will create more efficiency and that will allow tech workers to be more productive, perhaps allow you to hire fewer of them. And so the conversations that were happening in the sustainability and responsible tech, like corporate responsibility landscape in 2021, 2022 were quite different, especially because there were conversations around shareholders being really committed to ESG values and the idea that companies really, in order to compete, had to compete for employees, right? So employees would not want to work for a company that was doing things that were bad for the environment or, ethically dubious in some way. And that this was a matter of concern for investors, for shareholders. And so we've certainly pivoted away from that. And I think with Microsoft and many other companies also failing to meet their net zero goals because of data center expansion, it just shows you that the priorities overall of the industry have shifted, but the problems remain. And what it feels like is that net zero was a helpful kind of marketing goal in a lot of ways, but it was not something that companies were really committed to in a real way. And we often hear that AI has the capacity to help solve a lot of the problems with climate. But no matter how much efficiency you have, even if you are able to use AI in ways that can benefit, say, the reduction of emissions, it's not speaking to the overall problem of demand. And so if you are endlessly expanding your data centers, which are themselves incredibly carbon intensive to produce, if you're creating much more powerful AI chips that require even more, resources and are also rendering obsolete an entire fleet of devices and chips from previous eras, then what you're doing is creating a lot of waste and you're creating a lot of emissions that efficiency alone is not going to solve. And so I think part of the problem right now is that there's been so much focus on generative AI as the thing that is sort of the future of the industry, ignoring the fact that many signs are pointing to an AI bubble as well. And I think we have already forgotten the lessons of blockchain.
I think the tech industry has a very, very, very short memory for what goes wrong. And part of this is, I think, this idea that we do believe in this silver bullet. We do believe that there is going to be some big solution that's going to solve everything. Whereas it does seem to me to feel more like a system problem, that you have to cross between different silos and you have to start different conversations across them, because certainly for someone who spends time working on renewable energy, there's this constant battle going on about critical minerals and about, are batteries going to work and will they be there for balancing out renewable energy because critical minerals, it's a problem. Where are they coming from? And you think, well, no one's talking about how many critical minerals are used in a computer chip or a mobile phone or a computer. And we're just kind of continuing to focus on build that out. So, I mean, you mentioned the hugely carbon intensive nature of data centers. Well, what are the other sorts of issues we need to be thinking about? Because you also mentioned the layoffs that are happening and the different interests that people have in what they're looking for in a job, whereas now you could argue they're just looking for a job. But I think this is a really important part. We saw this with the actor strike last year with the use of AI. And I think for a lot of people, that's the first time it became something mainstream. It's affecting industries that people would never have expected to be affected. So, I'm back to what should we be worried about?
Well, and earlier you raised the question of, even coders, even software engineers are being asked to use generative AI in order to make their work faster. And so the expectations around productivity have shifted for a lot of people in so many different fields. Clearly it affects creative workers, especially journalists and artists in very particular ways. And actors are part of that as well. And so in models, we've seen that as well, where rather than hire diverse models who are real humans, you have AI create perfectly diverse, multicultural models for you. And so you don't have to pay real people. And so much of the issues that we've seen with generative AI's labor impacts is that it basically gives management an excuse to cut down on labor costs, to expect more productivity for less money, and to attempt to automate particular kinds of jobs. And so thinking about the labor impacts of generative AI, I think is very important. And I think, those labor impacts do end up connecting to the environmental impacts as well. And so another aspect that I think is really important to get at, which is often left out of these larger conversations about measuring the environmental impacts of AI. So we've had more of a conversation now about not just the carbon footprint of particular models, but also looking at their water cost and looking at how much land is required for data centers. And so thinking about the whole spectrum of different resources, then also thinking about what are the ramifications of, how is this affecting, say, manufacturing workers who are producing AI chips? How is this affecting e-waste economies for people who are essentially scrapping old systems, and how is that contributing to pollution in particular parts of the world, including in India and China? How is the sort of local community around a data center being impacted? So another kind of genre of story that we have are the horrible noise pollution associated with data centers, people getting migraines and having a whole host of other physical reactions. And then the question is, how are data center workers being impacted as well? And what are the expectations around their productivity, or in what ways is this expansion changing their work lives? And so I think part of the problem with the environmental impacts of AI is that we tend to focus on just one small part of the picture, and we're not thinking about what it means within a particular community, within the regions where data centers are expanding, and then the reverberations of the entire system. And so when I was at Intel, Mel Gregg, who brought me into the sustainability program office that she developed, her entire mission was to focus the company's attention on circularity and thinking about reuse, and who are the communities who are going to be taking up devices that are cast aside and that are no longer considered viable on the market, even though they are still usable. And how are they refurbished, and what is the kind of ecology of refurbishers and secondhand dealers? What are the different circular economies that are attached to the entire chain of production? And those kinds of questions seem to be very absent right now. I would say that now what we have is an attempt at some semblance of net zero. And apparently we're also now going to abandon those goals. But everything does tend to be much more focused on just the narrow carbon emissions as the main metric by which sustainability is measured.
This to me is one of the big challenges that I find, which is the huge take up of the concept of ESG, followed by the huge pushback against ESG. And I think there's part of me that just fails to understand how understanding what risks you face as a political issue. It doesn't make any sense, because if you're talking about a resource constrained world, you need to actually manage those resource constraints in order to build your business the way you want to.
Well, thinking about how climate catastrophe is going to affect data centers, like the cooling needed for data centers, which also relies on water. But the fact that if you're building data centers in places where drought is happening, where, intense heat waves are happening, then the data centers themselves may also suffer breakdown and may harm your business. And I think the idea that you can just expand endlessly with no repercussions is part of the problem.
I think that what that raises to me is this very interesting idea about AI and how it's being deployed and where it's being deployed and how it's being supported. Is that how do we sort of measure and manage the environmental, social, and ethical governance challenges in a way that we can actually avoid greenwash? Because one of the things that has come out of the push for ESG approaches is the demand for increased transparency, demand to understand what companies are doing so that we're not running headlong into a, explosion of over extraction until it's too late, but we actually understand the pathways we're on. What can AI help us do that? Or what do we need to question about AI in order to achieve that effective understanding of what's going on and how we do avoid greenwashing what we're doing?
Yeah, I think that the push for more transparency also definitely requires better standards in place for not just the measurement of emissions, but also understanding perhaps different factors. And so having frameworks where you're evaluating a whole different set of criteria and having some standards for evaluation would be useful. Part of the problem right now is that we always use the term AI for so many different things.
And it's machine learning. It's a multitude of things.
And and there are ways. So thinking about, remote sensors or other mechanisms that can help monitor large swaths of land. There are aspects or things like climate modeling. These things are useful and really important. But then somehow, generative AI that is like creating a bunch of images of large-breasted women, like that is somehow put in the same category. And so I think when people hear AI can help the climate, we're not talking about generative AI helping the climate. Like that is definitely not what we're talking about. And so I think that's part of the problem right now is that when you hear these conversations about there are trade-offs and AI can be useful for the environment. Well, it's not ChatGPT that's going to be useful.
Yeah, ChatGPT is not going to forecast where the next drought is. At least it seems unlikely to me.
Yeah,
definitely. So I think that's an incredibly important part of the work that you're doing now is actually having that conversation about how you have to differentiate between what you're talking about. Because I think one of the growing challenges in almost all conversations about sustainability is depending on how you're framing your approach to sustainability, you can be using the same words and meaning completely different things by it. So can you explain a little bit about how the AIMLab at Data and Society works and, this idea of public interest methodologies, which I'm fascinated by?
Yeah. So essentially, there's been a lot of regulation around things like algorithmic impact assessments and the call for stakeholder engagement. So the EU AI Act has a lot of mandates now around stakeholder engagement. So there are a lot of debates within the responsible AI community and also within civil society about what that should look like and what that looks like in practice. And so part of what AIMLab is doing is thinking about the regulatory landscape but then trying to understand before there is a real mandate. So before companies are told you have to do this algorithmic impact assessment in this particular way in order for your product to go to market, there's a way of understanding what these processes should look like, and coming up with different methods and approaches for doing that work in different case studies. And so we basically partner with a lot of different kinds of organizations who voluntarily come to us and say, we would really like to get a head start on understanding how we can evaluate our technology and do that evaluation through the inclusion of impacted communities. And so what we do is we take a product that maybe is, still in formation and not yet released, or is something that, say, a city government is thinking about deploying, and we form a relationship with the research partner site, with the developer or deployer. And then we think about which communities are more likely to be impacted by the technology. And so in some cases, if it's like a chatbot for wellness purposes, it's probably going to be largely the user base. And so some of those workshops that we conduct might look more like traditional user testing, in that we're not looking at just functionality. We're also doing a form of community red teaming, where essentially we have people interact with the chatbot and try to break it. And we notice what goes wrong. When does the tech fail? When are the answers just terrible and not ethically sound? When is there misinformation? But then we think about the secondary issues. So is there a capacity for deception? Is there a capacity for dependency on this chatbot? And then we also think about downstream impacts. So we might also look at what are the forms of automation or labor displacement that are at risk. So who is this chatbot attempting to automate out of a job? And also, who are the other people around the end user who might be affected by their use of this chatbot? And so we kind of start with the user interface and, the functionality questions, and expand from there. And we've done this now in several different kinds of places. And one of the projects that we're kicking off now is looking at a more socio-technical way of understanding the environmental impacts of AI. And this comes out of, obviously, my background at Intel and my work with the Green Software Foundation. And so working with organizations like the Green Software Foundation and Green Web Foundation, who are very much about creating standards and policies and methods for measuring and mitigating the climate impacts of technology. Also working with folks at the Berkeley Human Rights Center and other organizations who are thinking about the human rights impacts of technology. So how do you begin to put those kinds of metrics on decarbonization and things like that into conversation with these community impacts? And how do we bring impacted communities, say the people who live around a data center, into that conversation about the environmental impacts of AI so that it is not completely abstracted? And that's the trick of what we're working on right now, is how do you begin to bridge conversations that are happening, internally within corporate organizations with particular kinds of tech workers, like those in corporate responsibility, versus the more grassroots, community-led approach to thinking about the measurement of impacts. And what we're doing right now is trying to think about how to put those different frameworks together.
I mean, one of the things that's fascinating to me about that is this idea of a particular socio-technical approach, which is trying to integrate these different elements, because we know there's a tsunami of regulation coming down the pipe. I mean, certainly on the CSRD, at the EU level, human rights is a fundamental part of what you have to report on. Early stages, you don't have to go into massive detail about your supply chain, but it is going to be required and in fairly short order. So I think there's the need for standards so that people can report on what's going on, because accountability is very important. But I think what's complicated, and I say complicated is the easiest word I know how to describe something I have no idea to get my head around, but how you use humanities and social science approaches to understand the development of AI? Because, you mentioned a chatbot, and I can understand a wellness chatbot and how that would relate to a particular community. But I'm thinking about basic misinformation, because where are these chatbots mining their data from? Where are they getting the conversations? Whose work are they using? How do you know it's right? I mean, one of the things that scares me is this idea of just losing critical thinking, because, well, it comes from AI. That must be the answer. And I do see that quite a lot inside my teaching, the instinctive thing of, because people are now used to a web that works. Because I remember in the early days of search engines, let's just say it wasn't quite as reliable as it might have been. Are we seeing the same things in AI?
Yeah, I think that is such an important point. And what you say about the regulation that is definitely just over the horizon in the EU, I think BSR, actually, I just saw on LinkedIn, they had a post about how companies in the US are going to screw themselves over if they don't start paying attention to some of these things. And that was an ongoing conversation, certainly within Intel when I worked there. People who were very much informed about what policy was coming versus, product managers and people who are under pressure to ship. And I think, this has been part of the problem, is that translation work. So often what we've seen in a lot of our pilot studies is that even when you take the findings of the community who is giving feedback, and maybe they see a lot of issues, maybe they are raising questions about the ethics of where the data itself is coming from, concerns about misinformation, a lot of that doesn't necessarily get turned into a technical fix. So the technical team may say, okay, we're going to make these tweaks, we're going to do this fine tuning, and then the product will be slightly more functional. But it's not addressing the larger, structural issue, which is like a chatbot should not be used for this. One, two, this entire product is based on a very ethically questionable data set and training model. And unpacking like what are the labor conditions of the data annotators? Like you could really start unpacking the entire supply chain and come up with basically a whole host of reasons why this product should not exist.
But that's the scary part, because the legislation that's coming down is about doing exactly that. It's kind of worrying that it's not being translated back into, it's almost like the technical teams are not using the feedback for useful decision-making, just technical decision-making.
Exactly. And there are very few people within tech companies who have the training and expertise to even do that kind of work. And if they do have people with those particular skill sets, they're often marginalized and not necessarily people who have a lot of decision-making power within the company. And so if the product manager is saying, we need to ship it, if
it's going to get shipped.
It's going to get shipped.
Yeah.
And there's a limit to what individual whistleblowers too can do. I mean, I think, so part of what my research looks at too is the power of collective action and thinking about how tech workers, perhaps not just within their own companies, but also across companies, especially in building coalitions with other grassroots organizations without, who are outside of tech. Like you really need to have perspectives from outside of the corporate tech realm in order to catch all of the issues and figure out how to strategize and mitigate them. Because in many cases, just a technical fix is not going to fix anything.
It's not going to address any of those issues. The thing that's weird about it is that companies who are buying that technology are literally buying those risks and internalizing them. So surely there's a potential for a huge amount of liability discussion when things go wrong.
And maybe that will be the thing that changes the way this is all unfolding. So when I was at Green Software Foundation and writing the Green Software report, we were trying very hard to make a business case for green software. And so it's like, hey, regulation is coming. If you want to be competitive, Also, like, energy efficiency is cost savings. There are ways of framing it, but even that alone is not enough of an incentive. It's the liability thing. So I think thinking about reputational risk, thinking about lawsuits, that might be one of the only levers, unfortunately.
Well, I don't know about unfortunately. I mean, it takes a long time, but I mean, when you think about the growing number of climate lawsuits 5 years ago, not that many. There's over 2,500 now. It's governments, it's large corporates, and there does seem to be an acceleration in attempting to hold people to account. And in many ways, if you've got the AI that can do the analysis that tells you of the links between certain behaviors and certain outcomes, yeah, that could be problematic in itself. It's fascinating. So, I mean, I'm just personally thinking what would be amazing would be a coalition between tech workers who care about this stuff with grassroots community people and companies who are terrified that they're going to be held responsible for things in the future. But I think one of the key questions I've got is if you're a business and you're thinking about using AI, because almost every business is, everyone's got someone in the business going, I've got a brilliant idea. We're going to use AI as a solution to this particular problem, whatever it is, because everyone just has a tendency to want to solve a problem without thinking it through. But what can or should businesses do when they're thinking about using AI? What should they worry about? What should they think about?
I think there's been such a scramble to integrate AI into everything. And the question is, like, is AI the solution to your problem? Does it add anything to your business model, the product that you sell? And this is something that has definitely come up within higher ed too, and K through 12 education as well. But the idea that there is a kind of FOMO aspect to it. So, we need to make sure that the kids know how to use AI, and we have to integrate it into curricula, or the students will be left behind. Meanwhile, not really thinking about what the trade-offs are when you do that. And I think speaking to the loss of aspects of the creative process, that is really bad, and basically allowing people to avoid the entire drafting, creative thinking process of watching as something kind of turns from scribbles or a few notes in a Google Doc into something more cohesive. And obviously, part of the problem with generative AI, especially, is the introduction of errors and other issues that you might not catch if you're not paying attention.
I'll be honest, some of my students very clearly do use AI. And it's at this stage quite easy to catch. I have a friend who works near, keeps saying, no, it's just early stage. It's all going to get better. And I'm thinking, yeah, but that's not teaching you how to evaluate a source or understand how it contributes to what you're trying to say or research or build or create. It just seems to miss a hugely important part of the human process of learning.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm quite terrified, actually, about what that means.
Okay, that's not reassuring given this is what you work on. I work on climate, so I get where you're coming from, but that's really quite challenging. I mean, one of the things I think is very important and that always happens very slowly is policy frameworks and political solutions, because politicians as a general rule tend to be operating a few years behind what's actually happening in technology. What is sort of the things that you think are the most urgent to address, both in terms of AI and tech infrastructure?
There has to be more regulation around the immediate environmental impact. So there has to be something to prevent essentially the problems that we've seen with the grid in the US, especially, where ratepayers and ordinary community members are being directly impacted by the energy consumption of tech companies. And I think, we can blame it on AI, but there are it's not just AI, right? It's like streaming, it's Bitcoin mining, which is definitely still happening. And so I think ensuring that there's more protection for communities where data centers and other infrastructures are being built, and that there isn't just a sort of land grab mentality.
One of my favorite questions to ask, which is always slightly unfair, which is, what haven't I asked you about that you wish I had or think I should have?
Well, I guess one thing that maybe we should talk about a little bit more is the problem of measurement translating into action. Because I think the net zero problem gets at that. So you're measuring and tracking emissions, and maybe you're using a variety of fuzzy math techniques and different offsets in order to arrive at a particular number. But I think in general, even when you are trying to do the right thing, if you're so caught up in the metrics and the practice of measurement, even creating standards, it doesn't necessarily...
that you forget to do anything about it.
Yeah, exactly. So, and this is a problem, and I have heard many engineers who are part of the green software movement who have made this observation. So how do you change the culture? How do you get people within tech companies to really care about this? And how do you incentivize it from a business perspective? How do you get C-suite to care about it?
And I think, that's a challenge I certainly don't have an answer to, because I think the development of offsets was an attempt to sort of create a market for action in this place. And that was supposed to happen. And it's clearly had its problems. But we've seen with the backlash against ESG that even when a strong framework is put in place, that doesn't necessarily mean that a particular company is going to acknowledge or act on that need.
Exactly. Like I think we can come up with really beautiful, holistic, socio-technical frameworks that we all agree upon, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there will be much behind it when it comes to making that work actionable. And that is something, that I've been kind of stuck on because, as you said, the regulatory landscape, politicians, they move fairly slowly. And so, why, with the AI Environmental Impacts Act in the US from Ed Markey's office, that was very much trying to frame the bill in a way that would be more palatable to companies. And so saying, okay, it's going to be voluntary. It's not really a mandate yet.
But the trouble is, when you're trying to make something palatable, you then end up making something that's ignorable.
Exactly. And I think with the knowledge that it would never pass in the US, and who even knows what our situation will be like, in a few months. And so I think that, we know that regulation is a big, big piece of it, but it can't do everything because you really do need the people carrying out compliance within tech companies to be able to do the right thing. And so you need that piece of it as well. And then you also need the public pressure. You need collective action. You need, unions to be involved. You need to have a mass movement. And it can be really hard to fit those things together. And you're going to have coalitions of people who really don't have a lot in common, which could be quite tricky.
No, I can see that. I really can. But it's an area which is of growing importance, because when you look at the cost of externalities in terms of doing business, and the fact that businesses are making money on a constant basis because they're not having to pay for the damages they're causing by the way that they operate, it does feel like there does need to be a public outcry against that to give politicians cover to implement demands for action. But again, sometimes it feels like we're living in a world where the politicians don't have as much power as they think they have, because they've only got the power that they can get away with implementing, which is a good thing in a democracy. I'm all about not being told what you have to do, but there's got to be a balance somewhere.
Well, and they're beholden to corporations. Particularly, obviously in the US.
I think pretty much everywhere.
Yes. But why are fossil fuel companies?
Why do they get tax breaks? Oh, I can't imagine.
Why,
it's a really, really challenging area, and one that I think we could talk about for an enormous amount of time. Yeah. But I think for the purposes of our discussion of AI and, how we need to change the way we think about it, I'm just going to say, Tamara, thank you so much for joining us. I've thoroughly enjoyed listening to you. And, hopefully we'll be able to continue this conversation another time.
Definitely. Thank you so much for having me on. This has been great.
To our listeners, thank you for joining us today. And don't forget to follow us on socials and subscribe to Shaken Not Burned wherever you get your podcasts.